Hello everyone, our group have 4 members: Jiang Jingyi, Kitty, Zhou Tianyu, Queenie, and Zhang Shenyu males, and I'm Olivia, Huijing. The topic of our presentation is Who are indigenous people? A discussion from the perspective of food. This is our outline. We will make our presentation from 3 aspects: historical background, food and story, and special figure. Now I introduce the historical background. White people from Europe brought plague and blood to Native Americans. These white people are not only invaders, but liars, butchers, and ungrateful traitors. White people brought their ambition, brought their colonization, brought Christianity that wanted to replace the indigenous people's own belief, and brought a bloody and cruel history. Today, those Native Americans are still facing oppression. The European colonists who came to America in the 16th century brought devastating disasters to Native Americans. This race, which had lived on the American continent for countless years, took in the so-called heroes of the New World from Europe and taught them how to survive on this pure land. However, these white people who were helped by the Native Americans carried out a policy of cultural and ethnic extermination against this kind of group. However, the brutal oppression and slaughter of Native Americans always seem to be understated. Among all the news about racial discrimination that we can learn about, there are about blacks, Asians, and Latinos. However, it seems that we rarely hear about the news related to racial oppression, racial slander, racial discrimination, and other racial problems faced by Native Americans. But the fact is that Native Americans are always facing racial problems. As our professor said, in fact, despite the available statistical evidence, most people don't know that Native Americans are most likely to be killed by police compared with other racial groups. Native Americans make up about 0.8% of the population, yet account for 1.9% of police killings. You may have heard that the Native Americans used to be very good at making buffalo skins and fur into clothes. Native Americans in Alaska even made whale skins into things like gloves and hats. All these actions are the wisdom of harmonious coexistence between human beings and nature, accumulated during the long life of this ancient race in the American continent. However, you may also know fried bread and roasted corn stew, whereas some stories behind them. Of course, you may also have heard of the white invaders who slaughtered the buffalo that the Native Americans depended on, in order to drive them into the reservations. The Native Americans were forced to farm, and as time went on, the land became more and more barren, and increasingly unable to keep up with supply. What's more, the American government failed to keep its promise and even imprisoned the West free race into reservations with all kinds of coercive means and dirty tricks, so as to make the Native Americans suffer from starvation. It's no exaggeration to say that the history of starvation of Native Americans is also the history of oppression of Native Americans, which more nakedly reveals the essence of white people as invaders, liars, butchers, and ungrateful traitors to Native Americans, and the history behind these foods is proof of that. We have learned some knowledge about these foods' history and stories in our class, and during the rest of our presentation, we will also show you the food handed down from Native Americans to today, and the stories behind these kinds of food, which includes the native food of Native Americans before the arrival of red invaders, and the food that newly appears after the invasion of red people. We will also introduce special figures that bravely speak for Native Americans. And at the end of our presentation, we will also give our reflections and appeals. Now let's begin our next part.
Food is an indispensable part of human life, regardless of nationality and race. However, food usually comes with different stories, shaping its meaning for people of distinctive historical and cultural background. For Chinese people, food is determined by cultures and always accompanied by beautiful implications. For instance, during the Spring Festival, we have dumplings. Because dumplings resemble ancient Chinese gods, we regard it as a lucky dish that brings us wealth. For Mid-Autumn Festival, we have mooncakes. A round mooncake symbolizes prosperity and reunion for the whole Chinese family. However, for the indigenous communities, the traditional food doesn't always represent culture or a blessing. In most cases, indigenous cuisine comes with oppression rather than good wishes. Today, our group's presentation will introduce representative indigenous food, focusing on their racist history and detrimental implications. The first one is fried bread. As you can see from the side, fried bread is a flat-doughed bread fried or deep-fried in oil. Despite variety across indigenous tribes, a typical fried bread recipe consists of flour, water, salt, a small amount of oil, and baking powder. The simple ingredient of fried bread conveys two messages. For one thing, fried bread is tasty but not nutritious. Making from flour and baking powder and cooking in oil allow fried bread to be sweet and put a crazy spell on anyone who craves it. However, this ingredient poisons the indigenous people's bodies. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a plate of fried bread consists of 700 calories and 27 grams of fat. Lack of nutritional value, fried bread dramatically contributes to health problems among indigenous people, such as obesity and diabetes. For another, fried bread was exotic to the indigenous community, although most tribes in the U.S. eat it as a dish. Fried bread is highly dependent on flour and powder, but before the white colonial's invention, there was no wheat in the American. Traditional indigenous dishes couldn't focus around a crop that wasn't grown. Namely, fried bread is not a chilled indigenous food, it was a recipe that adapted outside, which closely related to indigenous people's survival under the colonialization. In reality, fried bread appeared in indigenous community after the implementation of the reservation system. The white government displaced indigenous people from their homelands and isolated them from the white neighborhood. Without provisions for the government, indigenous people could not leave reservation. Hundreds of miles away from their land, where they could forage, hunt, and grow familiar crops, indigenous people starved. Therefore, accompanied by the forced displacements, the white government issued indigenous people food rations through the food program. Commodities like lard, salt, and sugar became the only provisions in the indigenous food boxes. Fried bread was born out of necessity in this era of starvation. Using rations of flour, salt, and lard provided by the government, indigenous people created the recipe for fried bread to help them survive. Fried bread successfully filled the empty belly of indigenous people because oily and sugary ingredients gave them the feeling of fullness. But when they put significant quantity of salt and sugar into their bodies, their chance of getting diabetes and obesity increased. In addition, the government destroyed indigenous people's staple food sources such as buffalo to make them weaker. Therefore, fried bread is not the result of indigenous cultures. Instead, it stems from brutal colonialism. Fried bread is a manifestation of food oppression, which is achieved by vanishing other racial demographic eating options. It is noteworthy that fried bread's legacy, that is food oppression directed at indigenous people, is not a thing of the past. It persists today in modern form, standing out mainly in food deserts. Food environment of indigenous reservations features high number of convenience stores and fast food restaurants, but few or no supermarket. While convenience stores sell food products, they generally offer high-calorie food that are low in vital nutrition. Due to the absence of supermarket to provide a wide selection of healthy food, indigenous people continue to eat fried bread. As a result, diabetes and obesity are prevalent in the reservation. The food desert thicken indigenous people's body and negatively affect their survival, since they are the smallest racial minority group in the Americas.
After learning about fried bread, now let's look at the distribution of food preference. Tribes in the Great Plains might have eaten buffalo and choke cherries.
In the East, they consumed wild turkeys, turtles, and other small game, and those in the Pacific Northwest had access to multiple types of salmon and wild onions. Indigenous people's food can be divided into 4 periods. The first one is pre-contact period, when indigenous people lived on the continent without external disturbance. They ate inherent American food: corn, beans, squash, chili, tomato, potato, vanilla, and coca. Although it is hard to imagine, but the truth is that at that time, Italians didn't have tomatoes, the Irish didn't have potatoes, Russians didn't have vodka from the potato. Half the British national dish, fish and chips, did not exist. No chilies in any Asian cuisine and any East Indian cuisine. The French had no confection using vanilla or chocolate. All of them would not be accessible without Native Americans' ingredients. When Europeans invaded Native Americans' land, they spread the above 8 major foods to the world. Invaders killed Indians to get their land. The American government even passed the Indian Removal Act. Native Americans from Southeast were forced to march thousands of miles in harsh conditions. Thousands upon thousands died. Those that survived were confined to a designated Indian territory. Through decades, even more tribes were forced to move to this place. Under the control of American government, the size of the land was becoming smaller and smaller. Other tribes were displaced to reservations. At that time, Native people were living on unfamiliar land and they didn't have resources they used to have. The government gave them commodity food to keep them alive, such as fried bread. They are high in sugar and salt, very unhealthy and not nutritional. Because the commodity food were completely different from Native Americans' original food, many elders could not get used to it and died. Even the food they consume today had roots in this painful period. Buffalo was a significant resource for indigenous people of North America for food and raw materials until near extinction in the late 19th century. In fact, for the indigenous people of the plains, it was their principal food source. Native Americans highly valued their relationship with the buffalo, saw them as sacred, and treated them in such a respectful way as to ensure their ongoing longevity and abundance. Humans, notably invaders from Europe, were almost exclusively accountable for the near extinction of the American buffalo in the 1800s. At the beginning of the century, tens of millions of buffalo roamed North America. These invaders slaughtered an estimated 50 million buffalo during the 19th century. They killed buffaloes so indigenous people would not have enough food to eat. This overhunting was in part motivated by the U.S. government's desire to limit the range and power of indigenous Plains Indians whose diets and cultures depended on the buffalo herds. They wanted indigenous people starved to death. From the picture, we can see piles of buffalo skulls. A typical food that indigenous people eat today is called possum boar. Possum means rice in the Osage language. Although one of the bowls feels routine, there's the base, a scoop of white rice, the meat or veggies, the beans, the mixed grains, the toppings, perhaps hominy and roasted green chilies, and the sauce. From the picture, we can see that this possum boar is made of white rice, black beans, shredded bison, yellow squash, jicama, zucchini, hominy, cranberry, cilantro, red onion, green chilies, and elderberry vinaigrette. It looks really delicious. If possible, I really want to have a try.
After learning these foods and stories, we'd also like to talk about one special feeder, Sean Sherman, an Oglala Lakota Sioux chef, cookbook author, and promoter of indigenous cuisine. He founded the indigenous food education business and caterer, the Sioux Chef, as well as the non-profit North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. He received the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award, and his book, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, published in 2017, won the 2018 James Beard Award for Best American Cookbook. Sherman was born in 1974 and grew up in Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He began to hunt and forage at an early age. He had always tried to depart from government commodity foods when he grew up there. At the age of 13, Sherman got his first restaurant job washing dishes, soon moving on to the line. Later he worked in a series of restaurants, and by 27, he was working as an executive chef. When he was burned off by 29 and went to Mexico to regroup, it was there in the marshes and beaches north of Puerto Vallarta, among the Huichol people, that he had what he calls an epiphany. He said, after seeing how the Huichol held on to so much of their pre-European culture through artwork and food, I recognized I wanted to know my own food heritage. What did my ancestors eat before the Europeans arrived on our lands? Therefore, Sherman went back to Minnesota and studied anything he could get his hands on that discussed the pre-European foodways of North America. And the result is the Sioux Chef, a mission-driven enterprise of indigenous team members with a mission is to reclaim, reinvent, and revitalize North American indigenous cuisine. So what is it like? He eschews ingredients introduced by Europeans in favor of foods indigenous to this continent. The famous three sisters of squash, corn, and beans are here, as are other native ingredients like sunflower and greens. Sherman also made studios of ingredients specific to the upper Midwest like wild rice and cranberries. Meat consists of duck, goose, grouse, venison, bison, lamb, even bear no beef, chicken, or pork here. Sherman has studied on his own extensively to determine the foundations of these food systems, which includes the knowledge of Native American framing techniques, wild food usage and harvesting, land stewardship, salt and sugar making, hunting and fishing, food preservation, Native American migrational histories, elemental cooking techniques, and native culture and history in general to gain a full understanding of bringing back to a sense of Native American cuisine to today's world. In general, our presentation first talked about the related history about the brutal facts European invaders have done towards indigenous people. Then we introduced some food from indigenous community and the stories behind it. Lastly, we introduced a famous Sioux chef, Zhang Sherman, who is promoting the indigenous food. Indigenous people are those who had long lived in the continent of America before this continent was founded by the European. However, those invaders came and ruined the peace and violence, bringing killing and disease. The indigenous food is not simply an object for eating, but the witness of hard days and how indigenous people used their wisdom to survive under the persecution. Even with so much oppression, it is a lot to have people like Chef Zhang Sherman who try to preserve and continue the indigenous tradition and culture. Thank you, that's all.